dark horizon swallows the Caribbean dawn as a single question shakes Washington's security establishment. What happens when one of Russia's most advanced air defense systems appears in America's backyard? The shock is immediate, the implications enormous. A quiet Russian cargo vessel departing Severomorsk, normally a logistical footnote, suddenly becomes the center of global attention when satellite analysts detect what appears to be the unmistakable configuration of long-range S-400 components lashed beneath heavy tarps. Within hours, intelligence briefings in Washington, Brasilia, Bogota, and Brussels ignite with the same alarming conclusion: a new front may be opening, and it is not in Eastern Europe or the Middle East. It is in the Caribbean. The vessel's presumed destination, Venezuela, reshapes the moment into something far more volatile. For decades, the Western Hemisphere has been considered an uncontested zone of American air superiority. But now, as global tensions flare from Ukraine to the Strait of Hormuz, Russia seems determined to redraw that map. The movement of S-400 hardware, even before formal confirmation, signals a strategic shift, one that echoes loudly in a world already unsettled by expanding militarized blocs, contested borders, and rapidly advancing missile technology. In this cinematic unfolding, every radar mast, every shipping manifest, every grainy image from a port camera becomes a fragment of a larger story, one that hints at a broader challenge to US influence under President Trump's renewed security doctrine. Venezuela is not an accidental partner. Its military ties with Moscow stretch back to the era of Hugo Chavez, when oil wealth and anti-Western sentiment paved a political bridge across the Atlantic. Caracas already fields Russian-built Su-30 Mk2 fighters, Mi-35 gunships, and the formidable S-300 VM, yet none of these systems compare to the reach and precision of the S-400 Triumph. As reports emerge of Venezuelan personnel appearing at Russian training facilities, learning radar operations, missile launch protocols, and long-range interception tactics, the narrative shifts. This is not a simple hardware transfer. This is the construction of a new operational capability, one designed to outlive any single administration. The S-400 is not just another missile system, it is a statement. With a detection range of up to 600 kilometers and the ability to strike aircraft or cruise missiles from distances reaching 400 kilometers, a single Venezuelan battery could monitor vast portions of Caribbean airspace. Oil fields, ports, refineries, inland bases, and even sections of open sea would fall under its radar umbrella. Every reconnaissance aircraft approaching Venezuelan territory would face a new and unpredictable threat node. For the United States accustomed to uncontested intelligence gathering routes, this development lands as a strategic jolt. Russia's motivations extend far beyond supporting a distant ally. The symbolic impact is deliberate, a demonstration that Moscow can project military influence thousands of kilometers from its borders, despite sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and the continuing strain of the Ukraine conflict. By establishing a foothold in Latin America, Russia challenges the geopolitical assumptions that shaped Western strategy for generations. In the shadow of this move, questions multiply. Has the global security order truly shifted? Will the Caribbean become a new contested sphere? And how will Washington recalibrate its next steps as rivals test the limits of American patience? The shockwave has only begun. The story accelerates as the vessel approaches Venezuelan waters. Intelligence analysts from multiple nations begin comparing port activity in Severomorsk with sudden increases in military transport coordination around Caracas. According to open-source tracking, several heavy trucks normally used for long-range air defense components were positioned near receiving zones at La Guaira and Puerto Cabello, an alignment too precise to be dismissed as coincidence. Reports from Reuters and DW note that Russian logistics personnel, who typically accompany critical hardware, had registered travel toward Venezuela weeks earlier. For seasoned observers, these patterns echo earlier deployments to Syria, where Moscow introduced S-400 units after the 2015 air incident. The choreography now unfolding in Latin America seems eerily similar. Venezuela's military, though constrained by years of economic collapse, remains deeply integrated with Russian systems. The nation already fields Su-30 Mk2 multi-role fighters capable of carrying advanced anti-ship and air-to-air missiles. Its Mi-35 attack helicopters patrol dense interior regions, while the S-300 VM, though aging, still provides credible medium-range air defense. Yet none of these assets create the deterrent envelope that the S-400 can project. This new platform, if fully operational, would offer Venezuela the kind of layered air shield typically reserved for major military powers. The Caribbean's aerial landscape would transform overnight. Tracking radars from the S-400 system could illuminate aircraft far beyond Venezuela's borders, reaching deep into the Caribbean Sea. U.S. Air Force patrols, maritime surveillance flights, and intelligence-gathering missions, once routine, would immediately face contested airspace. Even civilian aviation routes might require recalculation if Venezuelan command protocols expand into air corridors previously unmonitored. Behind the hardware lies an even more consequential development: operational training. Reports indicate that Venezuelan officers have been seen in Russia receiving instruction on radar calibration, target identification, multi-missile launch sequencing, and integrated air defense network management. Such training suggests that this is not a symbolic gesture, it is capacity building at a strategic level. For President Nicolás Maduro, the acquisition real or rumored functions on two fronts. Domestically, it strengthens the regime's narrative of sovereignty under threat from foreign interference. Internationally, it signals a new era of defense partnership. Defense News and Janes point out that Moscow often uses advanced weapons transfers to cement long-term political dependency, ensuring its allies remain tied to Russian doctrine, spare parts, and operational support. Venezuela, already reliant on Moscow for oil sector management and debt restructuring, now appears more deeply embedded in Russia's military orbit. For Russia, the benefits are equally significant. Establishing a modern anti-access area denial A2AD bubble anywhere near the US mainland sends a geopolitical message. American dominance is no longer unchallenged, not even in its own hemisphere. This echoes Soviet-era strategy, but in a far more technologically refined form. With global tensions rising from Ukrainian drone strikes deep inside Russian territory to Iranian missile launches across the Middle East, Moscow seems intent on creating asymmetric leverage wherever possible. As the shipment moves closer to confirmation, one unavoidable question emerges: is Venezuela simply upgrading national defense, or is Russia quietly activating a strategic pressure point in the Americas? Shockwaves ripple through Washington as the implications of a Venezuelan S-400 deployment become impossible to ignore. For decades, U.S. security planners treated the Caribbean as a predictable, stable environment, an operating space where American surveillance flights, naval patrols, and rapid response forces held uncontested freedom. But with a single Russian missile battery, that assumption fractures. The S-400's range alone, up to 400 kilometers for its longest reach interceptors, allows Venezuela to monitor and potentially lock onto aircraft far beyond its air borders. Under President Trump, U.S. defense officials must now confront a scenario hardly imagined in recent years: the Western Hemisphere hosting a Russian-made anti-access area denial zone. Military analysts at NATO headquarters also take notice. The alliance has spent the last decade countering Russian A2AD umbrellas in Kaliningrad, Crimea, and Syria, where layered missile systems limit Western air mobility. A similar structure in Latin America introduces an unprecedented challenge. European governments, already strained by the ongoing Ukraine conflict and Russia's expanding missile attacks on civilian infrastructure, recognize the strategic symbolism. Moscow is signaling that Western pressure in Europe can be met with counterpressure close to America's doorstep. This geographic shift disrupts the traditional East-West dividing lines that defined Cold War doctrine. U.S. Southern Command responds with heightened surveillance, deploying additional maritime patrol aircraft to ensure regional situational awareness. But every move occurs under the shadow of uncertainty. If Venezuela receives the full S-400 package, including long-range search radar command vehicles and multi-missile launchers, American reconnaissance flights could face immediate risk. Even without firing a single missile, the system's ability to lock onto aircraft forces pilots to alter routes and altitudes, increasing operational cost and reducing intelligence fidelity. The Pentagon has experienced similar complications in Syria, where Russian air defenses limit Western freedom of movement. For the Trump administration, the challenge becomes political as well as military. Washington must reassure allies like Colombia, Guyana, and several Caribbean states already concerned about Venezuela's expanding military partnerships. At the same time, the White House must avoid escalating into a confrontation that could provide Russia with exactly what it seeks: proof that it can disrupt U.S. strategy with minimal investment. Reuters notes that Russia has deepened defense cooperation with states located at critical pressure points around the world, exploiting gaps in Western attention and leveraging arms transfers as geopolitical anchors. Inside the US policymakers debate whether the S-400 represents a defensive measure or a strategic provocation. Defense News points out that the system's capabilities far exceed any threat Venezuela currently faces. No South American nation is preparing for offensive air operations, and regional disputes such as the Guyana-Venezuela border claim remain mostly diplomatic. Why then would Caracas seek an air defense shield usually deployed against top-tier militaries? The answer may lie in a combination of regime survival, external dependency, and Russian ambition. Jane's analysis suggests that Moscow uses high-end air defense exports to secure long-term influence, creating clients who rely on Russian doctrine maintenance and strategic alignment for decades. The result is a geopolitical tension point with unclear boundaries. A powerful foreign missile system placed within reach of US flight corridors introduces an uncomfortable question: how long before the Caribbean, once a quiet maritime crossroads, becomes a strategically contested zone between two global power centers? As the Caribbean braces for a new strategic reality, analysts begin drawing parallels with other global flashpoints, revealing how the Venezuelan S-400 saga fits into a wider pattern of shifting power balances. The deployment mirrors Russia's broader reliance on long-range air defenses as tools of influence, seen most dramatically in Ukraine, where Moscow has expanded missile shields around occupied territories and critical bases. BBC and Reuters reporting shows that Russia now integrates layered systems from Panzer units to S-400s to counter Ukrainian drone swarms and long-range strikes. The philosophy is unmistakable: deny airspace shape, territorial perception, and control the narrative of who may fly where. Venezuela, far from the Eastern Front, is now adopting a fragment of that logic. But the parallel extends beyond Europe. In the Middle East, Israel and Iran are locked in a rapidly escalating technological arms race. Iranian missile infrastructure, augmented by Russian and Chinese components, grows more sophisticated every year, prompting Israel to expand its own air defense networks. DW's analysis highlights how both nations increasingly rely on radar range, early detection, and counter-missile precision as they prepare for worst-case scenarios. The Venezuelan S-400 fits into this same global pattern. States under geopolitical pressure turn to advanced air defense systems to compensate for conventional weaknesses, deter intervention, or send political signals that transcend their borders. Meanwhile, across the Indo-Pacific, the US-China rivalry intensifies. China's militarization of the South China Sea, reinforced by long-range radar systems and surface-to-air missile batteries on reclaimed islands, mirrors the strategic message now emerging in Latin America: control the skies, and you control the tempo of regional escalation. Defense News notes that Beijing's A2AD envelope is designed to complicate US operational planning, especially near Taiwan. Now, with Venezuela potentially fielding its own Russian-built A2AD bubble, the Western Hemisphere reflects the same strategic vocabulary spheres of influence defined not by diplomats, but by radar horizons. This interconnected landscape shows that Venezuela's move is far from isolated. Instead, it forms one point in a global constellation of shifting alliances and deterrent structures. Russia gains leverage by distributing powerful defensive tools to partners willing to challenge Western norms. These partners, Venezuela, Iran, Syria, receive systems that boost regime survival and project political defiance. In return, Moscow secures footholds that complicate Western military planning and stretch US strategic bandwidth across multiple theaters simultaneously. The result is a world where airspace has become the new frontier of geopolitical competition. Nations no longer seek merely to defend territory. They seek to manage perception, influence regional calculations, and deter potential opponents without firing a shot. A radar dome sweeping across the Caribbean can exert pressure as effectively as a battalion on the ground. This convergence of strategy across continents forces analysts to confront an uncomfortable truth: as Russia expands its defensive reach and as China shapes its maritime air zone, the United States must navigate a world where its traditional dominance of the skies is no longer guaranteed. In this global environment, Venezuela's alignment with Russia becomes more than a regional shift. It becomes a symbol of a planet rearranging itself around new centers of gravity. And as these parallels deepen, one question rises from Washington to Brussels to Bogota: is the world witnessing isolated tensions or the gradual formation of a new multipolar defense architecture that could define the next decade? Across the Caribbean, the human dimension of this unfolding military drama begins to surface. Beneath the high-level strategies, radar signatures, and satellite images lies a region already struggling with economic strain, mass migration, and fragile governance. The arrival, or even the anticipation of an S-400 system introduces a new layer of tension into daily life. Coastal communities accustomed to watching fishing boats and cargo vessels cross the horizon now find themselves under the widening arc of a foreign air defense network. Conversations in markets and ports reflect a growing unease. What does it mean for ordinary citizens when their skies become part of a geopolitical chessboard? For Venezuela, a nation enduring years of economic collapse and shortages, the deployment of a sophisticated missile system is met with mixed emotions. Supporters of the Maduro government frame the potential arrival of the S-400 as a shield against foreign aggression, a way to protect energy infrastructure that has suffered from sabotage, decay, and international isolation. Oil fields and Zulaya refineries near Puerto La Cruz and strategic ports would fall under the system's radar umbrella. Yet for millions of Venezuelans navigating daily insecurity from power outages to food scarcity, the symbolism of a multi-billion-dollar defense platform feels disconnected from their immediate struggles. Neighboring states view the development through a different lens. Colombia, already wary of Venezuelan military modernization, must now consider airspace management and border surveillance with heightened caution. The long-standing migration crisis, millions of Venezuelans crossing borders in search of stability, intersects uneasily with rising military posturing. Countries like Trinidad and Tobago, Aruba, Curaçao, and Guyana depend on predictable maritime routes for trade and energy shipments. Any perceived militarization of Caribbean airspace risks raising insurance costs, delaying shipments, and stirring political anxiety. Even tourism-dependent economies still recovering from global instability worry that headlines about advanced missile systems could cast a shadow over the region's image as a safe harbor. Humanitarian organizations also voice concern. Red Cross coordinators and UN agencies operating in the region warn that geopolitical saber-rattling can divert resources and diplomatic attention away from urgent social crises. While governments debate radar ranges and engagement protocols, issues such as healthcare shortages, illegal mining networks, and cross-border criminal trafficking continue to impact families across rural and coastal zones. In many ways, the introduction of the S-400 symbolizes a widening gap between state priorities and civilian needs. At sea, the impact is equally tangible. Fishermen operating near Venezuela's maritime borders fear tighter patrols and expanded monitoring zones. Commercial captains express uncertainty about how new air defense protocols could affect emergency flights or search and rescue operations. International insurers begin recalculating risk models, factoring in the possibility, however remote, of misidentification incidents in contested air corridors. Yet perhaps the most profound human impact is psychological. The Caribbean, long perceived as a peripheral theater in global power politics, now finds itself in the crosshairs of a symbolic confrontation between Russia and the United States. Ordinary people sense a shift. Their region is no longer just a cultural and economic crossroads. It is becoming a place where global rivalries test their reach. Under President Trump, Washington's rhetoric emphasizes deterrence and sovereignty, while Moscow frames its actions as support for partners resisting Western pressure. Caught between these narratives, civilians wonder what comes next. In the streets of Caracas, Bogota, and Port of Spain, the same question echoes: is this deployment a step towards security, or the beginning of a deeper, more unpredictable tension that could touch every corner of the Caribbean? As global attention sharpens, the Venezuelan S-400 question evolves into something larger than a military transfer. It becomes a test of resolve perception and the fragile balance between deterrence and escalation. Intelligence agencies continue piecing together movements from Severomorsk training rotations in Russia and Venezuelan military preparations on the ground. Each new data point deepens the sense that Latin America is entering a strategic landscape unlike any it has seen since the Cold War. But unlike past eras, this confrontation unfolds in a world where conflicts are interconnected, technologies evolve rapidly, and political narratives spread at digital speed. For U.S. military planners, the calculus becomes more complex by the day. If Venezuela activates a functioning S-400 battery, American reconnaissance flights operating near the Caribbean basin would be forced to adapt or withdraw. The United States, long accustomed to unrivaled aerial reach in the hemisphere, must decide how to respond without risking miscalculation. Under President Trump, the administration faces competing imperatives, demonstrating strength to adversaries, reassuring regional allies, and avoiding a crisis that could cascade into a wider confrontation. The slightest misinterpretation, a radar lock, an accidental intrusion, a diplomatic misstep could trigger an escalation neither side truly desires. NATO also watches closely. Though physically distant, the alliance sees in Venezuela the same doctrinal challenge Russia poses in Europe, the creation of defensive spheres that limit Western freedom of movement. In Crimea and Kaliningrad, these bubbles complicate air operations across the Baltic and Black Seas. In Syria, they reshape the balance between Israeli, Russian, and Iranian forces. If a similar structure emerges in the Caribbean, NATO must adjust its global posture, recognizing that Russia now wields influence in a region once considered strategically stable. Yet escalation is not the only possible outcome. Some analysts argue that an S-400 deployment could paradoxically reduce the likelihood of military conflict. By raising the cost of intervention, the system might deter reckless actions and encourage diplomatic negotiation. Others warn that such deterrence is fragile, dependent on perfect communication, and mutual restraint conditions rarely guaranteed in volatile geopolitical climates. The Guardian points out that advanced missile systems often embolden political leaders, giving them a sense of security that can lead to riskier decisions. Venezuela, already embroiled in territorial disputes, and internal pressure may interpret the S-400 as a license to act more aggressively in regional affairs. The most significant uncertainty lies in how long this balance can hold. As Russia deepens its overseas partnerships and the United States recalibrates global commitments, the Caribbean risks becoming the next arena in a broader competition for influence. A single radar sweep, a misread signal, or a provocative maneuver could transform political theater into military crisis. And so the hemisphere pauses, suspended between stability and turmoil. Nations across the region ask the same question: will the S-400 be remembered as a defensive shield, a destabilizing spark, or the opening chapter of a new geopolitical equation in the Americas? In this moment of rising stakes, the enduring tension remains clear. How far will nations go to secure their sovereignty, and how much will the world change as great powers test each other's limits in the skies above the Caribbean? A final question lingers for viewers. Is this the beginning of a new era of global competition, or a final warning of how fragile international stability has become? If you want to follow how this story evolves and how it shapes the next chapter of world security, make sure you stay with us. Russia's suspected shipment of S-400 air defense systems to Venezuela signals one of the most consequential geopolitical developments of the decade. Satellite intelligence port movements from Severomorsk and reports of Venezuelan officers training in Russia suggest that Moscow may soon activate a long-range anti-access area denial zone in the Caribbean, directly challenging U.S. strategic dominance under President Trump. The deployment would extend radar coverage hundreds of kilometers across regional airspace, complicating American surveillance routes and unsettling neighboring states. It fits a larger global pattern: Russia's reliance on S-400 systems in Ukraine and Syria, Iran's expanding missile capabilities, and China's fortified air zones in the South China Sea. The implications go beyond military reach. Caribbean trade routes, migration corridors, humanitarian operations, and regional diplomacy all stand to be affected. For some, the S-400 represents deterrence. For others, a destabilizing escalation that risks miscalculation. As global power centers shift and alliances harden, the Venezuelan deployment becomes a symbol of a world entering a new multipolar era, one where airspace influence and sovereignty collide. The central question remains: is this move stabilizing the region or quietly pushing it toward a new and dangerous threat?